Every year, the AGS Council accepts proposals from graduate students across the country for support for the final stages of their professional degree work. This past year, out of dozens of applications, 4 students were selected. We are proud to recognize them today. Mr. Jacob Dean from the University of Tennessee, who I think is here, Ms. Elena Diaz from the University of Waterloo, Ms. Megan Mills-Novoa from the University of Arizona, and Ms. Mara Vanderbold at Clark University. Congratulations. And now, before we continue with our journey of mapping people and places beyond boundaries, we're first going to hear from Dr. Joshua Hagan, who's going to give us a fast introduction to anomalies along the border. Josh?
So good afternoon. I was asked to talk about anomalies along the border, and as an academic, I first thought of, well, what does that actually mean? So I went to Google and Wiktionary and looked up anomaly. What is an anomaly? Well, it's something that's different from the norm. It's something that's irregular, inconsistent, strange, extraordinary. Well, what is a border? A border is simply commonly defined as a line that divides 2 distinct geographic areas. Normally, we think of a border as dividing 2 sovereign states. So then what would be an anomaly, an anomalous border? Well, that would be a border that is somehow intermittent, irregular, unofficial, invisible in some fashion. So I'm going to talk through some examples as part of 2 research projects I've been working on with Alexander Diener, who is just on stage. One was a book that we published a couple years ago, and one we're currently working on and hope to have out in a couple years. So what do we mean, but what might be an anomalous border? Well, we could look at Central Asia, at the intersections between Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, where we have some contorted shapes, contorted sovereignties, and an archipelago of exclaves and enclaves that would strike many casual observers as unusual, as strange, as political oddities. We have a similar situation along the borders between India and Bangladesh. All of those little dots, probably hard for you to see out there, are different exclaves and enclaves. Indian territory that is surrounded by Bangladeshi territory and vice versa, including some cases where we have enclaves that are within exclaves. So a very complicated situation that would strike many observers as odd, as perhaps even unnatural. We could look at a much larger case, the Oblast of Kaliningrad, which is a part of the Russian Federation, yet as we can see from this map, it is separated from the rest of Russia. And again, most casual observers would look at this and think it's an oddity, because our assumption is that territories should be contiguous, that sovereignty should not be disjointed or irregular in this fashion. All of these have their own unique stories, such as the British exclave of Gibraltar. It's a legacy of the British colonial imperialism and a repeated source of friction between Spain and Great Britain. Yet at the same time, Spain has its own exclave territories along the North African coast. These political oddities do not necessarily have to result in friction. On the other side, you can see Point Roberts, which is a part of the United States, the little end of the peninsula there, yet it's only accessible from the rest of the United States by car by driving through Canada. Even in situations where there's not this discontiguous nature, odd shapes such as the Caprivi Strip in Namibia or Misiones Province in Argentina are connected to the rest of the country, but they kind of seem as odd appendages and will strike many observers again as sort of unnatural or unusual borders. Yet these cases highlight the fact that all borders are the result of human action. These borders are no more unnatural or odd than any other border that might follow a course of a river, the crest of a mountain ridge, or a line of latitude and longitude. We could also think of frozen, of invisible borders, of borders that are there. They're very real for people on the ground, but they don't appear on conventional maps. We could think of the so-called frozen conflicts across the Black Sea and Caucasus region, where we have states or quasi-states like South Ossetia that are very real for the people who live there, but they commonly don't appear on maps, or at least maps made outside of the Russian Federation. Or we can think about proposals to redraw the line, such as this much discussed article from the New York Times several years ago, to redraw the map of the Middle East, including the possibility of creating a Sunnistan, for example, out of parts of Syria and Iraq. Or we could look at the invisible borders of maritime sovereignty in the South China Sea, where we have overlapping and conflicting claims from the various neighboring states. At the same time, we see a renewed interest in wall building, which I think has been mentioned by previous speakers. And we can think of different novel ways of bordering. So for example, when we had the influx of refugees and other migrants into the European Union in recent years, we saw the creation of an archipelago of sites of detention and deportation. So all of the different colored dots on there are some type of detention or deportation facility. And it highlights how the policing of the border doesn't just happen at the border, it happens in many cases on both sides of the border. Similarly, we could look at detentions, a similar geography of detention and deportation in the United States, represented on this map, where border enforcement and border infrastructures extend well beyond the actual line on the ground. Or we could think of another novel strategy of bordering, land reclamation, land dredging efforts in the South China Sea, first by China, and now other states have joined in as well. So we have land reclamation as a strategy to claim land, and by extension, the maritime sovereignty of the surrounding seas. One last final example, we could think of efforts to map indigenous homelands, a different way of conceptualizing the political organization of space and place. So these and other examples we could point to are anomalies along and beyond the border, and there's many other examples we could point to. I would argue cumulatively they all help point out that the world we live in, this so-called borderless world, is still a very, very bordered world and will likely remain a very bordered world for the near future. Thank you.